because I said what was on my mind. I made a lot of enemies. I made a lot
Welcome, everyone, to Science from the Fringe. My name is Bryce Nickels. I'm a professor of genetics at Rutgers University, and I'm thrilled today to be joined by Aaron Siri. Aaron is a leading civil rights attorney and managing partner of Siri and Glimstad. He's become well known for his work challenging vaccine mandates, promoting transparency and vaccine safety, and defending the principles of informed consent. His firm has represented clients in high-profile cases against government and corporate vaccine policies, including those related to COVID-19. And he's here today to discuss his new book, Vaccines, Amen, which I have right here, The Religion of Vaccines, which was just released in early September. So, Aaron, thanks so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
Good. Happy to be here.
So, given that the topic of vaccines is often, quite polarized, I wanted to actually start, since you're a lawyer, can you give a legal definition for what a vaccine is?
Yeah, or I can just give you a definition. My definition of what a vaccine is. My definition of what a vaccine is that it's a product that causes so much harm that the government had to provide immunity against the liability for those injuries. Vaccines, in fact, are the only product in America, the only one where you cannot sue the manufacturer to say that had you made this product safer, had you designed it better, my child would not have been killed or would not have been seriously injured. There is no other product like that in the entire country, and that's from a law in 1986. So I know that's definition might sound quite controversial, but it is. It's just the legal reality. So yeah, I mean, because some vaccines stop transmission, some don't. Measles vaccine stops transmission of the measles, virus. Other vaccines, many vaccines, most vaccines, in fact, don't. Some vaccines are made with RNA technology. Some are made with recombinant DNA technology. Some are made, some are toxoid vaccines. There's all kinds of different vaccines, but the only commonality that I could really trace between all of them, because they differ wildly across different vaccines, is whether or not they fall under and need that federal immunity for the injuries that they could cause.
That's why I wanted to ask you about the legal definition, because I wanted to get into that 1986 law, because it's a very important piece of your book. So this gets, I guess, what your answer there also gets to another question I want to begin with, which is, in the introduction to your book, you talk about your personal position on vaccines, which you refer to as your bias towards vaccines. So
Yes.
did you want to say any more about it beyond what you just gave for the legal definition of vaccines?
Sure. I mean, my firm, which has over 100 professionals, over 50 of them just engage in vaccine related work. I mean, we have the largest vaccine practice that I'm aware of in probably the world that doesn't represent pharmaceutical companies. And, as a firm, I only take one ideological position regarding the products. And that's that anybody who wants to get a vaccine should be free to do so. That's freedom. This is America. You should be able to get a vaccine every single day. You should be able to wear 17 masks, live in your basement, have your own stay-at-home order. Because that's America. That's freedom. And I'd support everybody's right to do so. At the same token, nobody should ever be coerced, mandated, censored with regards to these products, because that is destructive to freedom. It's destructive to the idea of individual and civil rights. So that's my position. That's my bias. My bias is that individual and civil rights regarding these products always need to be respected. And sometimes people say, well, then why do you ever even get into the safety and efficacy of these products? And that's because those who seek to mandate, coerce these products will argue they're safe and effective. And by doing so, they make that a legal and a political issue, not me. I don't get into the safety and efficacy of statins. I don't litigate statins because nobody's trying to force you to get them. Nobody's trying to coerce you. Nobody's trying to take away your rights or censor you. I'm not for or against statins. I'm not pro or anti statins. I'm not for or against vaccines. I don't think vaccines are good or bad. I just think they're a product and they should be treated as such. That's all.
The title of your book, of course, is Vaccines, Amen, which speaks to the framing of it. Can you go over a little bit about why you chose the title, and I guess perhaps the idea that vaccines are often treated with a kind of religious devotion?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I in the decade that I've litigated around vaccines, what I've come to find is that most of the common claims made about vaccines, they're just beliefs. They're dogma. They're believed through repetition. They're not based on evidence, not evidence-based claims. The claim that, for example, vaccines are thoroughly and robustly trialed before they're licensed. It's just not true. I go through every single vaccine clinical trial to citing to the FDA source documents, which we have often sued the FDA to obtain for almost all vaccines. And you could see most of them are licensed based on days or weeks of safety review after injection, no control or no, certainly no placebo control or no proper control group. I mean, you could use the standard care if that was properly tested, right? And they're underpowered. So you don't have proper control. You don't review safety long enough, and they're underpowered. These clinical trials, not a single one validate safety. And the post-licensure safety literature, the claim that they're robustly studied after licensure, maybe COVID vaccine to some degree, actually, but not the rest of them. And you just need to review the Institute of Medicine reports to know that that's true, because they have, were paid by the CDC and other government agencies to review the safety literature of vaccines, and they asked them, like, in 2012, for example, the Institute of Medicine was asked to review the 158 most common vaccine injury pairs. And the IOM came back and said, hey, look, for over 130 of these, sorry, can't tell you whether vaccines cause it because you haven't done the science. You didn't do the studies, right? So it's not me saying the post-licensure safety literature, that claim that's robust is not true. The Institute of Medicine is saying it substantively. Of course, there's the catch, there's the dogma, there's the safe and effective slogans. The claim that all vaccines stop transmission, or the claim that millions in America would die without, vaccines, or that they did die with before vaccination also, or even even hundreds of thousands, even tens of thousands a year would die. Just not supported by the data. The problem is all these things get repeated. And in my 10 years of litigating against health departments and opposing the world's leading vaccinologists, immunologists, infectious disease doctors, I find that they too believe these dogmas. And the incredible part is that when I confront them with the data, right? Folks can go one way and go, ooh, I need to revisit this. They can respond with the intellect, or they can respond and hold on to their dogma. And what they have to do is they respond with emotion, the way you do when you have a belief, right? You hold on to that belief and you say, no, 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 you're wrong. They get angry. They attack you personally. It becomes ad hominem. They have to censor you. They have to mandate. They have to do all the things that you do when you're not willing to accept the reality. You don't need to censor falsehood. You need to censor the truth in any event. So that's how why I call it the religion of vaccines, because so much of what you hear about vaccines are just dogma. They're just beliefs. They're not science. They're not data driven.
One of the key figures of the vaccine, I guess, the religion of vaccines, is the person who you began your book with, Dr. Stanley Plotkin. So I think you obviously began your book with him because he plays a key role in I guess, how this, what you would call the religion of vaccines, has sort of come to be. Can you explain who he is and what his central role is in the sort of vaccine space?
Sure. There are vaccinologists, and most people think of, well, my pediatrician will tell me about vaccines. No, they don't have deposed endless pediatricians. They don't know anything about vaccines. Or immunologists will know about vaccines. They don't know anything about vaccines. Or ID doctors, infectious disease doctors, they too know virtually nothing about vaccines. The folks who do know somewhat, who actually work on vaccines are vaccinologists. Okay. And those are the folks that, that small group of vaccinologists, they're the ones who write the medical textbooks, they write most of the peer-reviewed literature about vaccines. They're the ones they can conduct the clinical trials. They produce the data and the studies that then get filtered through the health agencies and so forth. That's what ACIP relies upon, so the FDA relies upon, and so forth. Anyways, those vaccinologists, at the top of the heap is Dr. Stanley Plotkin. The standard medical text on vaccines is called Plotkin's vaccines. The gavel at ACIP, that's the CDC's advisory committee with regards to vaccines. The gavel is called Plotkin's gavel, excuse me. He's published over 800, probably more studies and reviews and articles about vaccines than anybody else. He developed the rubella vaccine. He was a co-inventor of the rotavirus vaccine, and he involved in the development of numerous other vaccines. I mean, he's the world's leading authority on vaccines, and what he says about vaccines is literally just taken as fact by the rest of the vaccinology community. And then that filters down. I'll give you an example. One of my favorite ones is that it's not so substantive, but they often make the claim that, nothing has contributed to, reducing mortality beyond other than safe water than vaccines. And and if you trace every one of that time, you'll find it everywhere in the literature. People cite it in articles everywhere. And they all cite back to Plotkin's vaccine book. And in Plotkin's vaccine, you know what that cites to? Nothing. And when Plotkin makes that claim in peer-reviewed articles that get published in The Lancet and Nature, he also cites to Plotkin's vaccine book. You know what he cites? Again, nothing. So, I mean, but because Plotkin said it, it seems true. So, Dr. Stanley Plotkin, and Paul Offit said in his own words, Stanley Plotkin trained a generation of scientists, vaccinologists, to think the way that Dr. Stanley Plotkin thinks, and hence understanding how Dr. Stanley Plotkin approaches vaccinology, vaccines will help you understand the field of vaccinology, and then that trickles down through the rest of the medical profession, into the media, into the public consciousness.
So you famously deposed him back in 2018. I think that was one of that kind of put you on the map, perhaps. I don't know if that's fair to say, but I thought it was noteworthy the circumstances under which you deposed him. Can you explain what that was?
So there was a case that was making national news, actually, a mother who didn't want to, who was not vaccinating her child. Her and her husband had agreed to that. And then they were getting divorced, and the husband then decided he wanted to vaccinate. The mother wanted to continue what they had been doing already. They were before a judge who had already thrown one mother in jail who didn't vaccinate her child. So, I'll just let that sit there. The dad, because it was in the national news, because it was getting all this attention, they thought, and there was a nonprofit, there's an organization out there that promotes vaccines that thought maybe it'd be a good idea to get a vaccinologist involved who can defend these products, right? The vaccinologists, at the end of the day, they have a sense that, the vaccinologist won't show up to U.S. Senate hearings and sit on the other side and debate me. The vaccinologist won't show up to debates. They won't do that in public. They'll send like a poor infectious disease doctor who thinks he knows but doesn't know about vaccines to those types of forums. But for whatever reason, Dr. Plotkin agreed to be the expert witness in this case, incredibly. As far as I know, maybe the only time he's ever done that, other than he said one case that was narrow decades prior. Any event, he came into the case as the big expert who's going to show everybody why this child had to be vaccinated and how vaccines are safe and effective. And so I got an opportunity, as was the right of each party, to depose him for 9 hours, which I did, and just asked him questions, all on video. Afterwards, the mother actually released the deposition video. It was on YouTube. It got millions of views, and then it got taken down. It was just a deposition. It's his answers. I'm just asking questions. It's the world's leading vaccinologist answering questions, taken down, and then people just keep putting it back up. I've just seen it go on for years and years. In any event, so that's how that came to be. After I deposed him, he then didn't show up for the trial, didn't end up participating actually in the case. So actually, the only thing we have is the deposition. And when we moved to subpoena him after the deposition for records to support some of the stuff he said, he instead got a lawyer to quash it because he doesn't have the support, because it's not supportable. In any event, that's how it came to be.
How common are cases where one parent is suing another over the right to vaccinate their kid?
My experience is it happens in the divorce proceedings. So the divorce proceedings are going on. There's animus going on, and in my experience, oftentimes one parent, often unfortunately, um, one parent will use that as leverage against the other parent in the divorce proceeding because they know maybe one parent just, is more concerned about it. So they'll use it to try to get leverage for some other value or benefit. Seen that happen all too often, unfortunately.
I see. Okay. Well, let me get back to the book because I was saying that Plotkin, of course, you begin the book talking about Plotkin as this central figure in vaccines. The other key piece of background, I think, is something that you alluded to earlier, which is the 1986 National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act. Can you discuss that? Because I just introduce what that is, and I have several questions about that because
Sure.
when you read about it, I find this astonishing. This law is just incredibly what it's done I don't think is what it was originally intended to. So can you introduce this act and we can talk about how it's still having these lasting effects today?
Absolutely. So leading up to 1986, there were only three routine vaccines in the United States: DTP, MMR, and OPV. The amount of injuries that they were causing was resulting in liability for the manufacturers of these three products, such that there were six, I believe, six companies selling measles vaccine down to one. I think there were six for pertussis down to one, three for polio down to one. So one company left selling each. And the amount of liability was so great from the harms they were causing, they too were going to potentially go out of business. Now, companies face and industries face this juncture in the road all the time, where the amount of harm they're causing looks like it's exceeding potentially the amount of benefits. So, what do you got to do when your gas tank? Now, cars, for example, have great benefit. It's wonderful. But when, there's a famous, car that gas tanks were blowing up and killing people, right? And so what do? You don't say, "Oh, we'll just make it say you can't sue the car company and let the car gas tanks blow up." You say, "Hey, the market forces compel the car company to make a better car so the gas tanks won't blow up. If your plane's falling out of the sky, make a better plane. If any of the building materials you use in a household cause cancer, make a better building material." Just go down the list. If your drug for your heart disease, for cancer, for whatever, is causing serious harms beyond the benefit, right? Then make a better drug. Um, but in the case of vaccines, Congress did something unprecedented. It said to these manufacturers, hey, listen, don't worry about it. You don't have to make a better, safer product that's not harming kids. We will just pass a law, the one you just mentioned, the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986, that will make it so that no parent forevermore will be able to sue you to claim that had you made that product safer, my kid wouldn't have died or my kid wouldn't have been seriously injured. That is what I call in the book the original sin, because what it did is it inverted the normal forces that make products safe. The reason that cars are safe has nothing to do with the government. It has to do with economic self-interest. Companies want to make money. So they want to make sure their car, their drugs, you name it, is safe before they go to market and after, because they don't want to lose money. It assures safety. We've seen what happened in governments where you don't have the right to sue for those things, like the old Soviet Union. You think products were safe? You think super government regulation, but yet did that make products safe? No. What makes products safe is economic self-interest and the ability to hold companies accountable. Our free market system works in that regard very, very well, actually, right? You don't even need a lawsuit most of the time. But with vaccines, this law inverted this. And every single vaccine since 1986 has been clinical trial by a company knowing they wouldn't have to pay for those harms. So you've inverted the normal market forces. And we've gone from 3 injections, if you follow the CDC schedule, in the first year of life, by the first year of life, excuse me, where today a child following the CDC schedule gets 29 injections by the first year of life. And virtually every one of those products was trialed and put on the market by a company knowing they're not going to pay for those injuries and deaths. It's a very troubling situation in my view.
And so here's what I don't get about this law, which is why, from a legal perspective, I asked you that question about the way you answered that question, where I said, "What's the legal definition of a vaccine?" I think is quite telling. Originally, this was covering 3 vaccines, right?
Yes.
That's law. So why is it that later vaccines get covered under this law?
Mhm.
What makes them? I don't get that piece of it. How
Yeah,
do you
well,
get?
the law specifically it covered, and you'd have to go back to the folks who were in Congress back then when passed the law. It not only covered those 3 vaccines, it covered any routine childhood vaccine that thereafter. So any vaccine developed after those 3 vaccines that was a routinely recommended childhood vaccine which was then added to the table and had an excise tax. Those are the prerequisites. Was then granted this immunity. Not only, by the way, if it was used by the children, but used by adults. So flu shots is a routinely recommended childhood vaccine that meets the prerequisites, and hence the immunity attaches to its use not only for children but also for pregnant women and for adults. Well, pregnant women would be adults, but it would be adults who are injured by it as well. So virtually every vaccine is covered by the 1986 Act. Um, and look, you know, uh, you know, drug people will say, well, that's really important. Well, we want to make sure there's vaccines. Okay, well, there are drug products for a very small population that cause a lot of harm that are able to survive without this immunity. How? They just got to do 2 things typically. One, make them as safe as technologically feasible, so you can't get sued for design defect claims, and disclose all the risks, including the package insert. You can't get sued for failure to warn claims. That's why drugs, even for small markets with that have lots of adverse reactions, can still be out there profitably. But you got to query, why can't they just do that with vaccines? Make them as safe as technologically feasible. Maybe recombinant DNA technology needs an update, right? Maybe we can do better than that 40-year-old technology. Maybe we can do better than the toxoid technology we've been using now for a very long time.
Aaron, can you explain that? I think that's a key piece, this design defect claims. Can you explain what a design defect claim is? And then also I found it noteworthy that the Supreme Court ruled on whether this law applied to this, correct?
Sure. So the primary way you hold a product manufacturer accountable typically is something called a design defect claim. There are famous cases. For example, I sell you a saw, right? A company sells saws, right? And for 1 penny, I could have put a piece of plastic over the saw on the portions that are just really not used, and you could have not lost your finger. You could have easily made that product safer, but you didn't. And so that's a design defect claim. Your gas tank, for 1 penny, given how many cars are made, could have put a stopper so that the gasoline, in the event of a crash, wouldn't flow in the wrong direction and then catch fire and explode, right? But you didn't do that, right? Meaning, as long as you can technologically make it safer, then and you don't, it can hold you accountable. And that's true of every product out there. You can sue companies for doing that. Now, there's limits to that, of course. I mean, it's not like you have to go and, well, if you made your saw with, these six, 1 penny plastic, you know what I mean, shielding, basic stuff, also becomes kind of the standard because look, you're the consumer, you're out there. You have a certain expectation when you go to buy a product. You don't, one, you have an expectation of what it will do or not do. For example, if let's use sheetrock. I just assume that sheetrock in my house is not going to give me cancer, okay? If you go and you use chemicals in the sheetrock that over time are going to increase my risk of cancer, I can hold you accountable for that. You could have made it safer. So that's a design defect claim. Now, and then separately was the failure to warn, right? So if you can't make it safer, fine, because you can only make a knife so safe. I can only make a car so safe. I can only make a drug so safe. And drugs are a great analogy to vaccines. There will be harms that this particular, small molecule, this drug is going to cause. Now, it has this benefit, but it's going to cause these harms. We're going to identify them. We're going to put them in the package insert. We're going to let you know about them, and then you can choose. That's informed consent, and I can't sue you afterwards if it causes that harm and it's not avoidable. I've made my choice. I knew about it, and so forth. So Oh, and I'm sorry, you asked about the Supreme Court
The
case.
Supreme Court case, because I think
Yes, I'm
that's
sorry.
noteworthy.
Brusiewicz v. Wyeth ruled on. So there was a challenge to the interpretation of the 1986 Act that a child who was severely injured by a polio vaccine, I believe, and brought a case and argued that no, you shouldn't interpret the 86 Act to provide immunity for design defect claims. And the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, no, no. Congress intended complete immunity, period, for design defect claims. It doesn't matter if it kills you. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they are, even for, it would be super simple to have made it safer and your child wouldn't have died. Doesn't matter. You cannot sue them for it. That's what the Supreme Court ruled. In fact, there were two dissenting judges, Judge Sotomayor and Judge Ginsburg, interestingly. Strange bedfellows, by the way, in vaccines. You never know what you're going to get. Who said, and you can read the dissent, it said, this decision by the majority creates a situation where vaccines that are already on the market are already profitable. It has no incentive for anybody to make them safer. So we could go 100 more years and nobody's got the financial incentive to make them safer. And they got it exactly right on that score.
So how lucrative are vaccines for the pharma industry?
They billions and billions of dollars. I mean,
Well, perhaps the question is, how lucrative does that law make them? That is to say, if they were forced to do more safety testing, how much would that cut into their profits? Can you estimate that, or is there
yeah,
a...
sure. I believe the vaccine industry has gone from about 100, $200 billion in revenue back in 86 to over 50 billion today, something to that degree. I mean, it's an explosive growth over a relatively short period of time. And also the percentage of the portfolio of certain pharmaceutical companies, in particular the primary makers of vaccines, which is GSK, that's GlaxoSmithKline, Merck, Sanofi Pasteur, and Pfizer, has grown precipitously in terms of the percentage of revenue that comes from biologic, from vaccines versus their drug products. Look, think about it this way, Bryce. If I came to you and I said, look, I got a great business idea for you. Okay, we're going to sell this thing, this injection. You're going to be like, really? An injection? What does it do? And is it going to hurt anybody? And you're like, and I said to you, don't worry about it. Nobody could sue us for it. I'm like, well, why would people take that? Don't worry about it. The government will mandate it. Well, won't people still be freaked out? You like, won't they rise up? Don't worry about it. The government will literally spend billions of dollars a year promoting them on top of it. And you'd be like, so let me get this straight. No liability, free marketing, a guaranteed market. Well, what if nobody wants to pay? Don't worry about that too. The government's going to pay for them. Something called the Vaccines for Children program pays for basically almost 50%, and plus state programs, almost half of vaccines. If a child can't pay for it, if they don't have insurance, the government will pay for it. So add in guaranteed payment, guaranteed market, guaranteed marketing, guaranteed immunity. Yeah, sure. What company wouldn't go into that business?
There's also a thing you talk about in your book related to that law where HHS, people thought, well, this removing the financial incentive, that's for doing things safely is a problem. So we're going to add what was called the mandate for safer childhood vaccines, correct? And can you explain what happened with that? Or I guess what was that? And then what has happened to that safety?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Congress, to their credit, when they granted this immunity to pharmaceutical companies, I assume understood, maybe intuitively, maybe collectively, that they just eliminated the market force, this economic self-interest that drives product safety. That's the way we make sure products are safe in this country. And so what they did is they actually effectively transferred all the safety responsibilities from industry over to the Secretary of HHS, over to the Department of Health and Human Services. That is the federal department in which all our health agencies are located. CDC, the FDA, the NIH, HRSA, HR, all of them. They're all in there, okay? And so HHS, in a section of law called the Mandate for Safer Childhood Vaccines, it's three simple paragraphs, essentially, three simple sections, is the section of federal law in which all vaccine safety, in my opinion, is underpinned in this whole country. Okay. Now, when you go through the mandate, you get a good sense of how vaccine safety has been treated since the passage of the 1986 Act, because the mandate for safer childhood vaccine has three. Let's just go through three sections. The third section, let's start from the bottom. The third section is that every 2 years, a report is supposed to be submitted to Congress on how to make vaccines safe, and what HHS has done to make vaccines safer. That report has never been submitted. Has never happened, ever. And that's easy to do, and they haven't done it. The middle section actually provides that HHS, there's supposed to be a task force created that's supposed to make recommendations to the secretary on how to make vaccines safer. This task force is supposed to be headed up by the heads of the NIH, FDA, and CDC. And they're supposed to, say, hey, here's how we think it should be made safer in this way, this way, this way. That task force was formed apparently, but was disbanded in 1998 after making only one set of recommendations ever. That's it. Okay. And then there's that's an easy thing to do, and they're not doing it. Then there's the first part of the mandate, and that's the hard part. That's the part that says, hey, HHS secretary, you got to make vaccine safety in every possible way. You got to make them safer in how they're clinical trial, on how they're post-licensure safety, and how they're distributed. You name it. Right. And so, the task force is supposed to advise the secretary on how to do that, make recommendations. They're not doing that. And then that report was supposed to be submitted to Congress explaining what was done. That report's never been submitted, not once, even though at this point we should have one every 2 years. There should be a good, almost 20 reports. So if they're not doing the easy parts of the mandate, do you really think they're doing the hard parts? No. And I think I make the case for that very clearly in my book, all cited to the FDA sources for the clinical trials and the IOM and other reviews and so forth for the post-licensure literature.
And one thing you do say at the end of your book, you talk about how now with Bobby Kennedy in charge of HHS, there are some things that he could do. One thing he can't do is repeal that law, but wouldn't he be able to enforce this piece of the law or initiate this again? Is that something that we could potentially expect him to do? Or in theory, I guess you're nodding your head, so I'll take that as a yes. So perhaps
Absolutely.
if he watches this, because it's on the books.
Well, the task force has now, for the first time since 1998, been reconstituted.
Oh, okay.
And
There you
so
go.
it now it was just reformed. So that is back. And absolutely, Secretary Kennedy can fulfill the mandate. And I think he's trying really hard to do so. I think he's trying really hard to do so.
Well, who could object to that? I think everyone would support that, regardless of what side you're on in this issue. If there are sides, I think we would all. I mean, it's a law, right? Follow the law. I
See, and this really goes back to the religion of vaccines, because I think a lot of vaccine, quote unquote, science is, when you look at the studies, it's they're not done in the way that I would typically expect the scientific method to occur in studies. Usually, you'd have a study design, and you then follow it through, right? And you'd want to be very objective. I've through deposing vaccinologists, and really looking under the hood through millions of pages of FOIA responses that we've gotten through HHS, which also involved the conduct design and work on the quote unquote science. Unfortunately, I think that a lot of what is viewed on whether something's a good study or not in the vaccine universe is who does it, not the actual data and not the design. And so I think when Secretary Kennedy, it happens under his watch, I think they'll just taint it that way. They'll view it that way. They're not, they'll cast it out of hand rather than really look at it okay, is this a well-designed study, or not?
Well, one thing I will say, I mean, and reason I appreciate your book is that you do take the time to go through each individual vaccine one by one. You're not making these, sweeping claims, but about, where you're glomming everything together and saying that you really do take the time to go through and give, explicit explanations of why you say there are, deficiencies in the evaluation of specific vaccines and the limitations. And that's one thing I really appreciate about your book. The other thing is I think there are some very telling, I guess, examples or anecdotes that speak to why everyone should pay attention to this. So one that I'd like you to discuss relates to how people with vaccine injuries are treated relative to those who are injured by infectious diseases that vaccines are, made for. So you talk about a child named Maddie de Garay. Can you explain who Maddie de Garay is and what has happened to them since they suffered a vaccine injury?
Sure. So, to your point, if go to a doctor and you go to your family practitioner and you say, I've got X injury from a name the product, name the scenario, often you'll just get treated. You say that you were injured by a vaccine, same injury, right? Same, you claim you have encephalopathy from whatever it is, but you say it's from a vaccine, you do get a very different treatment and you get a very different write-up in the medical records, which we see all the time because we do tons of vaccine injury cases in the federal court of claims. You can sue for vaccine injury cases. You just have to sue the federal government. You can't sue the manufacturer. Now, in the case of Maddie de Garay, she was one of only about 1,000 children who received the vaccine in the Pfizer clinical trial for children 12 to 15 years of age. So typically there are separate trials for children because an adult trial can't be used to license a biologic or a drug for children almost ever. They have different effects in children and so forth, and they have different effects at different ages in children. So this was for the 12 to 15-year-old group. And so she, shortly after her second injection of Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine, was rushed to the emergency room and suffered a cascade of medical issues thereafter, eventually ending up in a wheelchair with a feeding tube. And, her treatment over at Cincinnati Children's Hospital was disturbing. If had she suffered those injuries in any other setting, I think, I believe that she would have been treated and treated properly. She would have had the full workup she should have had, which she didn't, because I think they're worried to find that there is some neuropathy, that there is some actual dysautonomia that resulted, that there is some, actual real underlying, biological harm that resulted. So instead, they, uh, I, without getting too deep into, what they did, she wasn't treated properly. But that's not a surprise. It's not a surprise because, um, folks who call our firm about vaccine injuries, um, this is a very common way that these folks are treated. And the irony about it is this. I always get people saying to me, well, those folks who call you about vaccine injuries, well, they're just anti-vaxxers, and I'm always laugh at that. I laugh because, those who are anti-vaxxers, whatever that means exactly, okay? Webster's that says that it means you oppose mandating one or more vaccines or getting one or more vaccines, which means most of the country are anti-vaxxers, by the way, because over half the country opposes flu shots and COVID vaccines. But anyway, or at least not getting one. Um, uh, I say, no, the folks who you are thinking of as anti-vaxxers don't call my firm vaccine injuries because they don't get vaccines. So they don't call our firm for vaccine injury. These are people who got the vaccine. They went and did what they were supposed to do. And this is what I'm talking about. This is the gaslighting I'm referring to. This is the treatment. Because it's like this intuitive thing. Oh, you're saying a vaccine injured you? Oh, well, then you're an anti-vaxxer. You're anti-science. You're a this, you're a that. Uh, No, these are just folks who went and did what the medical community said they should do. They trusted them, and they ended up getting harmed. And I mentioned that you can bring a claim for a vaccine injury. You just can't sue the manufacturer. There's a special program. This is what the '86 Act created, where you don't get a judge, you get a special master, and it's really a policy-driven program. The compensation is very limited. There's no right to discovery. I mean, it's you're and there's a very narrow set of injuries they'll compensate. It's paid out over $5 billion for vaccine injuries. But when those folks contact us, even if the treating provider had told them, yeah, I think it's related to a vaccine, right? Oh, you just got the Gardasil vaccine, football star, everything's fine, gets a Gardasil vaccine, and then all of a sudden it's got like dysautonomia of some form. They're like, yeah, I think it was probably the HPV vaccine that you shot. But then they don't put it in the medical records, and then when I would like them to come and give me a declaration or come to vaccine court to testify, whoa, 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 no, they won't do that. No way, they don't want to even be involved. If they even when they say to the patient they'll do it, most of the time they won't even do that. They won't even connect it. I, a lot of the folks who we represent for vaccine injuries are actually healthcare professionals because they will associate their flu shot with their neuropathy, where the average person won't. So, yeah, I mean, the treatment that those who are injured is it's sad because here you go, you get a family, they're just living their lives. They're doing what they're supposed to do. They're vaccinating their kids. One of their kids suffers, an injury from a vaccine. It happens. People say to me all the time, well, if vaccines cause injury or they had efficacy issues, I would know. And I always find that funny too, because I say, really? Can you tell me what drugs just went off the market? And can you tell me what injuries they caused? No, you don't. You know why? Even though they do all the time, because it didn't happen to you. Just because it didn't happen to you, I mean, it's not real. Drugs go off the market all the time. Drugs causing widespread harm go off the market all the time. And you don't know about it unless it happened to you. So why would you know about a vaccine unless it happened to you? So these families go and suffer an injury. One of their kids gets seriously injured, maybe even dies. It happens. Obviously, thank God most kids don't die from vaccines, but it happens. I've got plenty of cases where it happens. Okay. But obviously we're the firm they would contact, right? So, so we have the pool of those folks. Now, now they were like, whoa, science cannot validate that my kid who was already injured won't be injured by the other vaccines, even though that's not grounds for a medical exemption. And I don't know if it's going to hurt my younger kids. I don't know if I want to do that. So now they're maybe don't even want to continue vaccinating some of their other kids because they're worried about it on a medical level. But then how are they treated? Think about this. Even the kid that's injured, where you don't want to continue vaccinating, they live in California. California says throw them out of school. Can't go to school. You were injured by a pertussis vaccine, and now you don't want to get a Hep B vaccine? Bye-bye. So now your kid's thrown out of school, right? And think about how they talk about people that don't vaccinate. Imagine you spoke about any other minority or religion that way. I don't know any other people you can talk about the way they talk about people who don't vaccinate. I don't. They're selfish. They're stupid. Go down the list of pejoratives. You will hear it on national TV, on mainstream media outlets. Replace that with pick a race, pick a religion, pick an ethnicity. You'd be shocked. They'd never do it, but they do it for this group of people. So yeah, they're not treated well. And they're the folks who need the most protections of all the groups out there. That need a lot of protection amongst many of the groups out there.
Another aspect of this sort of coercion, I guess, is that you go over in the book. It relates to the way in which vaccines are advertised. So I thought it was striking. You describe a 2017 advertisement from GlaxoSmithKline.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that? I found that, and you litigated on that, I believe, right?
Yeah. So, there was an advertising campaign that depicted a grandmother who doesn't get a pertussis vaccine as a wolf. And, what it was insinuating, she would eat her grandkid if she doesn't get a pertussis vaccine because the idea is that she would be giving her grandkid pertussis and her grandkid would then die. Here's the thing about the pertussis vaccine. FDA went and did studies well, does the pertussis vaccine stop transmission? The reason the FDA did these studies is because, normally when a vaccine is resulting in a less disease, a less, not disease, excuse me, a less results in reducing the circulation of a pathogen, right? The interepidemic intervals get wider. So measles vaccine prevents the transmission of measles. So the interepidemic intervals got wider and wider and wider until it's effectively not endemic anymore. But that wasn't happening with pertussis bacterium. It was the interepidemic intervals remain the same. Some studies even show them getting shorter. Pertussis vaccine can reduce symptoms, but if it doesn't stop transmission, you still have the same circulating amount of pertussis bacterium in the environment because you're still carrying it in nasopharynx. You're still, spreading it. You might have less symptoms. Also means you're more likely to go to school, right? And so they did these studies and they found that, based on the best design studies they could do, it wasn't stopping transmission. There have been follow-up science done on it. And the scientific consensus at this point is that, and this is published in a consensus opinion by the vaccine industry's own scientists, their own paid scientists, and consultants, that pertussis vaccine does not stop transmission. Why? It doesn't create any mucosal immunity. So if it's not creating any IgA antibodies in your mucosal, in your lungs where it multiplies, when you are infected with the pertussis bacterium, it is still going to replicate in your lungs. It'll replicate in your nasopharynx. You will still have the same amount. It just does. It just creates a level because it's injected in your arm, right? You're not inhaling it. It's creating often a form of systemic immunity that's IgG antibodies typically, right? So you're creating immunity in the blood. So it can create a form of immunity that is reducing symptoms, but it's not, it doesn't do anything to prevent transmission. But they're not my words. I'm just a lawyer. What do I know? It is what the scientific community has concluded about this product. And so, think about it this way. The pertussis vaccine is reducing symptoms, but it's not stopping the amount of pertussis you're carrying nasopharynx, who's more likely to go to school? The kid that's vaccinated and spread it, the kid that's vaccinated or not vaccinated? The kid that's vaccinated who gets infected will still be able to spread it, but doesn't have less symptoms, so is more likely to go to school. The kid that's not vaccinated is more likely to have symptoms, right? And can spread it, but is more likely to be home in bed. So who's more likely to be in school spreading pertussis? The vaccinated children. It's just basic logic. It's just basic immunology. It's just reality. I know that people have a visceral reaction to that reality. I know that people have an emotional reaction to that reality, hence vaccines, amen. But that's just the science. So a grandma, just equate that to a grandma. A grandma who's been vaccinated is likely to have less symptoms. So does that, but it's, the science would reflect is as likely to continue to carry it in her nasopharynx. So who's more likely to transmit pertussis to their grandbaby? A vaccinated grandma or an unvaccinated grandma?
Well, so you speak about how scientists push back on you when you bring up things that make sense, like what you just said about the way in which, like, if you're taking a particular vaccine, you're not necessarily preventing transmission. In fact, by being healthier and moving around, you may actually spread it more. I was curious if you could, discuss a 2023 exchange you had with someone you mentioned earlier, Dr. Paul Offit, who, and the reason I'm bringing him up is he was just, I think I'm not sure why it popped into my Twitter feed or my X feed, but he has another Substack post yesterday attacking RFK and using this, the language of your kids will die if you don't vaccinate them, this rhetoric, like, appealed to this moral grandstanding that I actually find kind of, I find it gross, frankly. But you had you talk in your book about a discussion you had with him in 2023 that I think is quite telling, because as a scientist, he's supposed to be, coming back with a scientific argument to refute what you were saying about the lack of a placebo trial for, I think, the polio vaccine. but instead he did a bit of a sort of bait and switch. If you can explain what that exchange was about, I think that's telling about. It's an appeal to scientists. Like if you want to attack Aaron or go back at it, just do it with like credibility and good faith, not what this was. If you can explain what this.
Let's do it by evidence. I've
Yeah.
offered Dr. Offit. Listen. You pick the topic. You want autism. You want to do clinical trials. You want post-licensure safety. You want to do any stuff. I didn't say vaccines cause autism. Just to be clear, I just said it's like we can have an exchange on it. 10 minutes each for 1 hour. With my only request is that we have a projector where we can put up our evidence. He's never taken me up on it. We've, as you pointed out, we've had a back and forth on Twitter, and then it went on to Substack when he didn't like what was going on Twitter. Let me just start by saying this. Look, at the core, at the bottom, the issue, because I'm about to describe, I got him on this placebo thing, right? But at the heart of it's about protecting children. I agree with that. We got to protect children. The problem that I have with Dr. Offit substantively, okay, is that he focuses on protecting children from infectious disease, and we should protect every child from being harmed from infectious disease. I am completely agree with that. Every child is precious, but there's another side of the equation. We need to protect children from harm from these products when they could, as much as we can, or disclose them, make them as safe as possible. And let's work in the world of reality when it comes to these products, not make up what their clinical trials were, not make up what the post-licensure safety is, not pretend they do things they don't do, right? We need to stop being religious about them. We need to start being scientific about them. And so with that framing, here was my exchange with Dr. Offit. He was attacking now Secretary Kennedy, then candidate, I believe, Kennedy. And he said, this whole notion that routine injected vaccines weren't, licensed based on placebo-controlled trials is, nonsense or whatever he was saying, something like that. I don't want to misquote him or misphrase, but something to that effect. And so I said to him, I called him out on Twitter and I said, that's not true. I said, every routine injected childhood vaccine, and I've called him out on this, and I've many times said this publicly, and I stand by it because this is what the evidence shows. Every single routine injected childhood vaccine has never been licensed based on a placebo-controlled trial. Period. That is a fact. Okay. And when another vaccine was used as the control, that vaccine, because if there was a vaccine that was properly trialed and had a baseline of safety and was a standard of care, that should be the control, right? So if there's an existing Hep B vaccine and that was properly licensed, that should be the control. I agree with that. When another vaccine was used as the control, first of all, they're often not for the same disease. Go figure that. They're often just components of the existing vaccine, which is bizarre. But when it's another vaccine, that too is never licensed based on a placebo-controlled trial anywhere down the chain. And in my book in chapter 10, I go through every single routine injectable child vaccine, and I tell you what the control was. You got the FDA citation. I've got permalinks there in case the FDA citation goes away, and you should look at it yourself. You don't trust it? Go to the link, please. Go look at it. Okay. I will stand on any stage and debate anybody with this as long as I have a projector and can pull up the FDA documents, because I have no question. Now, Dr. Offit came back and said, oh, that's not true. They are. And he tried to do it in certain ways. One of the things he said was, well, that Mr. Siri is, doesn't understand what a placebo is. First of all, I know very well what a placebo is because I have the FDA and CDC definition, which is that it's something inert. Okay. So another vaccine is not inert. Aluminum adjuvant injection is not inert. An antibiotic injection is not inert. And so forth, which are often what they call, so Paul Offit says it's immunologically inert, which I responded to him on Twitter and I said, Dr. Offit, let's just assume your revised definition, which is not the CDC definition, but I'll accept it. Immunologically inert. Fine. You're still wrong because there's still not a single vaccine that was trialed against a placebo that was immunologically inert, because all of them are still, were immunologically active because they were an adjuvant, they were an antibiotic, or they were another vaccine in every single one of those controls. And I said to him as well, I said, anyways, next iteration, he then tries to, he insinuates it could be even broader. The problem is once you argue that a placebo is something that's not inert, then anything's a placebo. It becomes nonsensical. So injection of mercury is a placebo. Of course, that's not it. So he then writes a whole Substack about the casual cruelty of placebo-controlled trials. A whole article directed at me. And what was ironic about the article is that in this long article about trying to undercut my argument that there's never been a placebo-controlled trial, on the one hand, he's saying it's cruel to use a placebo-controlled trial. Bizarre. So are you admitting they didn't exist? I don't know. And then at the same time, he's saying they do exist, that I'm wrong, but he only has one example in his entire lengthy Substack. And he points to the Salk trial that licensed the Salk vaccine in 1955. Now, Dr. Paul Offit is one of the world's leading vaccinologists. He's one of the 4 editors of Plotkin's vaccine book. He's supposed to be able to take me to school when it comes to vaccines, right? But yet, apparently, he's never read the final report for the Salk trial. I have it on my shelf. In fact, most of my bookshelf are medical textbooks in vaccinology, immunology, infectious, pediatrics, because that's when I go to depose these people, I got to understand this stuff. Well, if you go to the Salk trial and you just open up the book, it describes what the control was not an inert substance. The control was an injection that included antibiotics. It included a bunch of other ingredients, included from out a bunch of stuff. Nobody would ever call it inert. And so, and I describe that all in my book. So I call him out on that. I said, your only example is not even a placebo. So he still to date has never provided an example of an actual placebo-controlled trial used to license a routine injector childhood vaccine. And the Salk vaccine is irrelevant anyway. It's neither used today, nor was it used as a control for any current polio vaccine. So I think that's the exchange you're talking about.
It is. He has to up his game. I thought it was pretty pathetic what he came in there. I wanted to ask you maybe if you have a difference of opinion on this. I guess I think the most sort of controversial thing or point you make in the book perhaps is this idea or concept of humanity having like an evolving ecological relationship with infectious diseases. And maybe you disagree with that, but I think that's kind of a not something that most scientists would want to, think about, because it almost makes an argument. I mean, in a way, you're making an argument that we shouldn't be vaccinating or we shouldn't be developing vaccines because it might disrupt sort of some sort of ecological equilibrium that humans have. And I guess perhaps that points to, discussions you have around, measles perhaps is one to draw an example with. Do you want to talk a little bit about this concept of maybe, I think this is the one that most people that sort of has a lot of people pushing back on, because they make it seem like, I think they label maybe like you're pro measles or something like that. But I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. It's interesting. I've actually never really heard anybody give me pushback on this so much, because I've not heard a lot of pushback from the scientific community on this, because, well, let's go through it and then I'll give you my feelings as to why that is. But well, first of all, let me just say that I don't think that this ecological relationship thing that you're discussing, which I'll explain in a second, means you shouldn't make vaccines per se. And I don't think it means that you don't need vaccines per se. I just think that it's something you need to really think about disease by disease. If you're going to approach vaccines as not a money thing, but as a public health thing, then you need to take into account all the impacts it has, including the non-specific effects, as well as the unintended consequences, right? You got to think about it big picture. You can't just look at it narrowly. So measles, I'll use the example you asked me to do, which is measles vaccine, as I pointed out, can prevent the transmission of measles, which means it can prevent the death from measles. Because if it prevents transmission and makes it not endemic, well, then nobody will get measles in that society potentially. And whatever measles deaths could have been caused by measles wouldn't happen, right? Now, great. Now let's step back and let's look at the big picture. First, let's talk about what was the reduction in mortality from measles vaccine. And then let's talk about, to your point about the ecological relationship, what impact did that have in terms of mortality overall, potentially, right? If we're going to think about it in a public health perspective. Well, in terms of the impact on mortality from measles vaccine was first introduced in the United States in 1963, first year it existed, period. So anything before 63, any reduction in measles mortality couldn't have been from the vaccine because it didn't exist. Measles mortality declined in the United States, this is CDC data, by over 98% between 1900 and the late 1950s, early 1960s, by over 98%. That 98% decline in measles mortality had nothing to do with the measles vaccine because it didn't exist. That's just a fact. I know everybody wants to, I know you'll often hear that reduction being attributed to the measles vaccine, but that's false. By the time a measles vaccine was rolled out, there were around 400 deaths from measles a year in the United States. At a time when measles was endemic, everybody got measles. That translated to 1 in 450,000 Americans dying of measles every year. Okay? Every death is a tragedy, not minimizing it, but I just want to put it into perspective. It's 400. It's not millions as often, not hundreds of deaths. It's 400 deaths a year. Okay? And, in a developing country where you have, you don't have clean water, where you don't have good living conditions, people will die of any kind of disease. It happens, including measles. Parts of this country were still like that back then. And so, there's no reason to assume that the measles mortality would not have continued to decline, as acute medical care improved, as health conditions improve. And let me just, before I move on to the ecological relationship, let me say this. I think that the public health professionals should take credit, probably, for most of that decline in mortality from measles. Better sanitation, probably, cleaner water, better living conditions, go down the list. They did that. They should get the credit, but they never take it for any reason other than vaccine. But just put that aside. Oh, and let's not forget acute medical care. That's improved too. You think acute medical care in the 50s versus today? Okay. With that said, but let's just assume that despite the fact that the U.S. population exploded between 1900 and the early 60s, yet you had rapidly declining measles mortality. Let's just assume that it would have continued to save 400 lives a year into perpetuity, okay? And there would have been no further decline. Fine. Now, what did eliminating measles do? Well, let's look at some of the studies. They're inconvenient, which is why most people haven't heard of them, but there was a prospective study in Japan that tracked 100,000 people in Japan for 22 years. And it looked at various variables. And one of the things it looked at, don't know why, but they did, the government of Japan did this, is or through the government of Japan data, is they looked at those who've had measles and mumps, whether they died of cardiovascular disease. And there was a statistically significant 20% decline in cardiovascular deaths after 20 years amongst those that had measles and mumps versus those that didn't. Think about that. Cardiovascular disease is the number one killer of Americans, kills 800,000 Americans a year right now. If eliminating measles and mumps has gotten rid of that 20% benefit, well, shoot, that's a lot of deaths. Now, obviously, an adult dying versus a kid dying, it's a difference in life years. But even if it's a 1% impact, you are way upside down on your public health benefit in life years. Let's use the proper metric, okay? It gets worse. And by the way, that's the only study like that I'm aware of, and I've never seen a study that contradicted it. And the results are, it's prospective. It's highly powered. It was well controlled. By all, as somebody who litigates, study design every day, it's a good study. I mean, it's going to be hard for somebody to attack that study. And there's no weight the other way. So the weight of the scientific evidence, there it is. It's right there. Okay, fine. But it's inconvenient. So um, there's also a long series of a bunch of other studies. Now they're smaller, they're retrospective, they're obviously retrospective epi studies, but that look at cancer rates amongst those that got measles versus those that don't. And what they found is that those that have kids that have measles, those that have had measles, have far less cancer of various kinds. 50% reduction in ovarian cancer, reductions in non-Hodgkin's and Hodgkin's lymphoma, 166%, depending on which one we're talking about. And you're talking about something that kills 20,000 people a year in America right now, many of them kids. So if eliminating measles caused that increase and had an effect on that, now that's a problem. So when I said in the book, I said, it may be, and I think I use that word may, because you can't prove causation with retrospective epi studies, but they're consistent on the cancer. And then and the only other one on the heart disease, like we already went through it. So the scientific body on this in PubMed is really solid. And so I said that it may be that the reason that measles, unlike so many other pathogens that have come and gone over the time, right? The reason that measles may have stuck around because it may have conferred a survival advantage. I'm not saying it does. I'm saying it may. And I would say I've got the weight of the scientific evidence on my side in that argument. And I'm happy to stand on stage and debate that point with anybody. Right. So, we need to think carefully, I think, and critically before we go and we engage in these programs that go and we jab something into the arm of every person. I mean, think about COVID vaccine. You went, you vaccinated almost the whole world. If you got that wrong, you only need to get that wrong once to mess up the whole world. So, we were I think a little bit of being humble and being more data driven and open-minded about the impact of our vaccine program is critical to making really good public health decisions.
Okay, I appreciate you going into that. I also mentioned the COVID vaccine. One thing in your book you talk about, which I found fascinating, is the statistic of how many lives were saved from the COVID vaccine is based on some blog post, I guess, is what the reference to that is. But one final question for you before I let you go.
Sure.
So you end your book talking about, the summary is kind of, and I think this is your vision, which is, or your goal is to make scientists persuade people on the merits, never use coercion. So I guess in theory, that in that world, you would be put out of a job, right? And what does that world look like, I guess? A world where you don't have to take up any of these cases. What do you, other than everybody's getting measles, I guess, Brent? No, just kidding about the joke.
Yeah.
But besides the measles, and no, the measles is one that always people are bringing up as like, gloom and doom. But what does it look like if you're successful?
Yeah.
Because I assume that you're looking to, rid the use of coercion and mandates for vaccines and really, what does that world look like?
Yeah, I'd be very happy to put myself, out of that job, so to speak. But on the measles point, if I just may, one thing is that look, let me just say this: now that we've had this measles program for so many decades, okay, measles is it can be dangerous. There's an age range where you should get measles, right? And so, you have the Brady Bunch episode where they're laughing about everybody getting measles. It's like chickenpox back then. Okay. And so, most people got measles at the right age range where it's generally benign. Okay. The statistics you often hear today about measles are not based on the pre-vaccine era rate of harm or death. They're based on the post-vaccine rate of harm and death. because after the introduction of the program and you got rid of an endemic, people now get measles when they get measles at the wrong age. Babies will get measles because the measles vaccine does not provide the same level of immunity to the newborn baby, either through the maternal transfers and the various ways that happen. And the measles vaccine does not confer the same type of lifetime immunity that having measles does, which is why if there's an outbreak, they often will go and give folks another dose of the MMR vaccine to adults. Okay, and so adults will get it, babies will get it. So yes, it can have more consequences, which is why I don't call for eliminating the measles vaccine in the book. I just point out the reality about what we just talked about earlier, right? If you were going to get rid of the measles vaccine, let me tell you, you would have a period of there would be, and it became endemic again. There would be that period where there are babies and adults who are not protected as they would have been in the pre-vaccine era when when it was becoming less and less and less pathogenic on its own. The program has actually ironically made it in a way more, I don't want to use pathogenic because that wouldn't be right to say it in that context, but it made those who are more susceptible, those who were not susceptible pre-vaccine susceptible. So we've mucked up the ecology of this pathogen, and the benefit that I described, it would be there could be consequences to try to get back to that. So
Well, you also talk about scarlet fever, which I thought is an interesting one, that
Right.
they tried to make a vaccine for scarlet fever, but they failed. And so, but we don't have scarlet fever today, but we would have had scarlet fever on the childhood vaccine schedule if they had succeeded, right? So that's kind of an
Oh,
example.
absolutely. Listen, it's like diphtheria. It's a lyophilized bacteria, right? And so there's a whole host of pathogens they were trying to make vaccines for and failed. And I am very confident had they succeeded, it would still be on the schedule and they'd be doom and gloom. We'd all die if you don't get it. But you asked me a question and I didn't
Yeah.
answer it.
Well, I triggered you. I didn't mean to say that
No, you
measles.
didn't trigger me at all.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
just wanted to make sure that I put it in the right thing. Now,
Yeah.
you asked me about, I just want to put it in context, but you asked me about, what is the end goal? Yes, I would be very happy to be out of of the work that I do on the civil and individual rights around mandated around vaccines. Look, I don't litigate statins because nobody's making you get them. Nobody's taking away your civil and individual rights, right? But they do that with these products. In fact, you often only need mandates when there really is an issue, right? I mean, uh, let me put it in a broader context, and I'll get specific to my work. For better or worse, our country is founded on as a rebellion against all forms of government that preceded it. And what were those forms of government? They were almost all governments where it was a centralized authority. It was a king, a dictator, a bureaucrat, a central bureau that was going to decide what you do in your life. And this country was founded on the idea that we have inalienable rights as individuals. We have individual rights, right? Civil rights. Now, obviously, nothing's perfect. We've gotten better and better at that over the decades. But it's the notion that, look, individual rights come with danger. Letting you say what you want comes with danger. Letting you assemble with who you want, practice what religion you want, right? Let the press say what they want. Sure, those things come with danger. Having the right to informed consent, having all these rights that we talk about, but that the greater danger is always ceding those rights to the government, is that we, as much as we can, limit the government's ability to impinge on those rights. And history has shown us that has been the right way to go. That is what I think has been part of the greatness of what this country is. And so when it comes to vaccines, um, there has been a loss in that particular band with the respect for that individual and civil right. Look, most countries don't even have vaccine mandates. Norway, Sweden, Denmark, a lot of countries, I should say. Most provinces of Canada, Australia, they don't have mandates for childhood vaccines to attend school. Okay. We are less free as a society than they are, amazingly enough. And when is it that the government needs to engage in coercion? Denmark, by the way, has a fraction of the schedule we have. Most of these countries do. Many of these countries do. 9 of the vaccines on the CDC schedule are not on Denmark's schedule, okay? Putting that aside, when does the government need to engage in coercion, censorship, bullying? It's when they can't persuade you. They can persuade you, they don't need to do it. It's when they can't persuade you on the merits that they then start by, okay, well, I'm going to give you some incentive. Not enough? I'm going to coerce you. Not enough? I'm going to coerce you some more. Not enough? I'm going to throw your kids out of school. Not enough? You can't get a job. Not enough? I'm going to censor you on social media. I'm going to get companies to make sure you can't say what you're going to say. That is what government does. Because when government sets a policy to do something like that, they then often overreach and they just keep going and going and going. You saw the overreach in COVID, and that's the danger of the government's involvement with these products, and that's the danger of mandates. Persuade people on the merits, and if you can't persuade them, that should be the end of the story. So yes, we have an immigration practice at my firm. What do most of the folks we help? We have 3 immigration attorneys. They were helping folks legally immigrate by getting a waiver for COVID-19 vaccine. We've helped hundreds, so over 700 people immigrate legally without getting vaccines. Waivers, they have like a 99%, success rate to date, is my understanding, based on the last data I looked at in my firm. Okay? But I fully supported the administration getting rid of the COVID-19 vaccine mandate for immigration. Yes, that gutted that part of our business. Wonderful. Happy day for me. In fact, even before the Trump administration, we brought a lawsuit to strike down that. We were bringing a lawsuit relating to strike down, and we were in the works to bring his lawsuit to strike down that requirement. That would be great. We have a class action practice at our firm on the plaintiff side that doesn't do vaccine work, and that does great work, helps society, makes money. This work that I do on the policy front. First of all, most of the cases we bring, there's no money in them. When we brought the lawsuit, to restore religious exemptions, to protect folks from being kicked out and so forth, a lot of those cases, they're about affecting policy. They're policy-driven, they're impact-driven, they're not driven by dollars, which I think is what really infuriates the government and the actors that we sue, because they're like, why are they doing this? And most of that work is supported by a nonprofit called the Informed Citizen Action Network, ICANN. So yes, I would be very pleased if there were no more mandates, the government proceeded by persuading on the merits, and the right to informed consent were truly restored. I'm very happy to stop doing the work, and when the day that happens, I will I'll even take the book when there's no more mandates and everything I said in this book is corrected. I'll take it off the market.
The scientists are doing a bad job of pushing back on you, and I think, to your point, it's because it's difficult to push back on a lot of the things that are in here. I highly recommend people reading it, and especially scientists, and take a look at it, because this is about, public health, protecting children, keeping people safe, and who would be against that? So thank you very much, Aaron, for joining me. Until next time, this has been Bryce Nickels on Science from the Fringe.